HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The World Doesn't Require You. Stories by Rion Amilcar Scott. Read by J.D. Jackson. Tony, me I want what's coming to me. Manny, oh, well, what's coming to you, Tony? Tony, the world, Chico. Scarface, 1983. David Sherman, the last son of God. Thou shalt have no other God but the Negro. The Lincoln Catechism. God is from Cross River. Everyone knows that. He was tall, lanky, wore dirty brown clothes, and walked with a limp he tried to disguise as a bop. His chin held a messy salt and pepper beard that extended to his Adam's apple, always clutching a mango in his hand. He used to live on the south side, down under the bridge, near the water. Now there is a nice little sidewalk and flowers and a bike trail that leads into Port Yuga. Back then there was just mud and weeds, and he'd sit there barefooted, softly preaching his word. At one time he had 100, maybe 200, some say up to 500 or even 1,000 people listening. But the time I'm talking about, he'd sit with only one or two folks, always with a mango, except during Easter time when he'd pass out jelly beans to get people to stop and listen. He lived on the banks of the Cross River until one day he filled his pockets with stones and walked into the water and sank like a crazy poet. He wasn't insane. It was all part of God's plan. Last time he was crucified, this time drowned. Anyway, God can't drown. He'll come back, perhaps to oversee the writing of another testament or to judge the living and the dead, whatever he feels. This story, though, isn't about God. It's about one of his sons. Not his son in the metaphorical sense. Well, he was, as we are all the children of God. But more so, he was his son in the physical sense. David Sherman was God's last son, the youngest of 13. 5 different women had lined up to sire the children of God. They were all boys except for the 5th, a disappointment who, at the age of 25, seduced her 15-year-old brother with her shapely behind and left Maryland to build a sinful life with him. God could have had more children, but he got a message from himself after David was born to stop spilling his seed into his servants. Who was he or anyone else to argue? David lived with his mother, Violet, in a 1-bedroom apartment on Sally Street that teemed with water bugs and mice, but rarely any rats. God slept there sometimes, but not very often. He'd rise early, long before the sun, and he'd tell his boy, "God morning to you, son." And David would reply, "And God morning to you, too." He stopped spending the night after David turned 12. To David, God was a disappointment. God told his son things from time to time, things about virtue and the coming Holy Ghost testament, but never anything David could understand. He wondered if one day he'd lose his mind and be out on the street speaking an incomprehensible gospel like his old man. And when David was 16, God took his own life. Even before God's death, David earned money by turning old pots and plastic barrels into drums and banging out intricate rhythms by the side of the road. After his father died and he inherited his harmonica, David stole a guitar from the neighborhood nerd. He taught himself how to play them in the privacy of the boxy apartment he shared with his mother, and eventually worked the instruments into the act. It never took David long to learn an instrument. He was always teaching himself a new one, but he was best at the guitar. Still, he loved the drums the most, even if he could only afford old buckets and tin pans. David thought himself a percussionist until Randall, a slightly chubby kid from a few blocks away, challenged him to a battle. They sat before those plastic buckets going back and forth, drumsticks raised high above their heads, the great clopping of plastic trash can rhythms, sweat pooling at their armpits in the thick summer heat. Randall's precision, how he danced and rocked as he drummed, was almost too much for David to take. He slowed to watch his friend, letting the drumstick slip from his slick hands. Soon he became just another spectator gazing. After his whipping, David mostly played the guitar to Randall's drumming, and sometimes he'd sing. People from the neighborhood often joined in to jam with dented and tarnished saxophones and trumpets. It was a good time. A little after David turned 18, his oldest brother, Delante, opened the Church of the Twice-Risen Christ on the South Side and asked him to play guitar on Sunday mornings. Delante, who now called himself Jesus Jesuson, everyone though referred to him as Jeez, wanted to look out for his little brother. David didn't believe what his brother preached and wondered if he really believed, but didn't ask. After all, he didn't know Jeez well. All that flash and dazzle, all that talk of God coming back as a general, leading an army through the streets and bathing the concrete with the blood of the wicked. Who could believe that? David played dutifully every Sunday morning beneath a stained glass window that portrayed his father as a shepherd in a cream robe, staff in one hand, sword in the other. It was a gig. For his work, Jeez kicked David $100 from the offering plate, and when the plate came up short, Jeez would reach into his own pocket and make up the difference. "God will always provide for you, little bro," Jeez said often. Despite his brother's money, David's pockets still felt like bottomless wells. God didn't always provide, and again he felt let down by him. While taking a walk one day, David spotted a drum set in the window of a downtown music shop off 7th Street. It was mostly midnight blue and glossy. Proper bass, cymbals, hi-hats, and toms. The works. Everything he and Randall had to improvise without. Something stopped him from moving forward. It was a thumping in the center of his chest that wasn't his heart. "The drums are the sun," he heard a voice say. He decided it was a stray thought, but still the drum set was what he needed to get his band going so he could make some real money. "I can't get them drums with the money Delante's paying me," David told his mother one night over rice and peas. "Violet," he said, "let me hold something." She laughed. "I don't have no money. Go ask the preacher," she said, scraping a metal spoon around a huge cast-iron pot. "Come on, Ma," he whined. "You don't give me nothing no more. I gave you life. You don't hear me demanding nothing from you for pushing you out and raising your ungrateful ass. As a matter of fact, give me that plate of rice and peas if it ain't nothing." Violet made a playful snatch for her son's plate. He shielded it with his arm and looked off into the distance. David didn't much feel like joking around. When David told his brother about the drums that Sunday morning, he too laughed. "Save your wages," Jeez said. "Then you can buy the drums." "Man, I can't hardly save nothing from them few dollars you give me. Between helping Violet with the rent and the electric, I don't hardly have $20 to my name by Friday. And I got to eat, too." "Get a job." "Then when am I going to practice my craft?" "Hit the streets, lil' bro," Jeez said. "Find better places to play, like downtown by River Hall. Go to Port Yuga. Hit the crackers up." David took his brother's advice and played one long night in downtown Port Yuga. He went alone, without Randall or anyone else, to avoid splitting the earnings. He would be the percussionist and the guitar player. He carefully set up his buckets as two teenagers heckled. One stood tall, with the belly of a middle-aged beer drinker, and the red pimples of a pubescent boy. The other sported a thin blonde mustache that made David laugh a little. The latter screamed at David over and over. David just watched him. Everything about him seemed ridiculous. The man told David his music was noise, and when he played louder, the beer-bellied one spit a thick glob of saliva into his tin cup. David shoved the mustached man. In the ensuing fight, the men smashed David's guitar and kicked his cup, scattering his change for passers-by to snatch. The night in jail gave David a lot to think about. Cross River had a rhythm. The river had a beat to it. That much was clear. He didn't feel it in Port Yuga. And if he presented it right, no one could tell him it was noise. It'd take time to learn to recreate that sound. By himself, it might be difficult, but Randall's playing opened up possibilities. The drums are the sun, he thought again, and it made sense. After Jeeves bailed his brother out, they drove to Cross River in silence. When they crossed the bridge, David said, "Man, Delante, you got to give me that money, bruh. It's urgent. If I don't get them drums, I'm gonna keep getting in trouble." "You trying to blackmail me?" his brother asked. "No, brother. You got a chance to be part of something big." "I am part of something big. I'm God's son. So are you. Why doesn't that satisfy you?" "I'm only me when I'm playing the music I need to play. You know, that Cross River sound." "Look, I'll tell you what. You go home and pray real hard to God, and I'll think about it. And if he softens my heart, I'll give you the cash." That night, David prayed for the first time since he was 12, when he still believed in his father's divinity. On Sunday, Jeeves said nothing of the money. David played with impassioned fingers on a guitar donated to him by a member of the congregation. They were fingers made of flames or of the bluest lightning. David sat with his brother in the front row after church let out, making small talk. When the conversation dipped, David said, "You gonna do me that solid?" "Well," Jeeves said, "I listened for God, and he spoke to me like he did when I was a kid, and he used to take me to baseball games before you or any of our siblings were born." "What did he say?" "God answers all prayers," he said. "Sometimes God's answer is no." Jeeves stood and walked to the door. "David," Jeeves said, turning toward his brother, "the money I paid for bail comes out of your pay." David spat on the door of the church when he stepped outside, right in his father's face. He snatched a rock and looked up, frowning, at the stained glass image of his warrior father. David cocked back his arm until pain filled his joints. He stood like that for a minute, and then dropped the stone. The next week, on a chilly spring day, Randall and David stood near Main Street with their buckets and pans. The sound hurt their ears. Randall banged out a rhythm but stopped mid-jam and told David his palms itched for the drum set. "Man," Randall said, "what we doing ain't really music. If we get them drums, that'll be music. Remember what you said about finding the rhythm of this town? How we gonna do that with some fucking trash buckets?" "How much you about to put toward the drum set, Randall, huh?" "David, man, I got less money than you." They became quiet. David knew his friend had more to say. "There's got to be something we can do," Randall said. "Something drastic." Several years before David's birth, God had left a sawed-off lever-action shotgun with Violet on the bedroom shelf. David had taken it down and played with it many times as a kid. It was something he never got tired of, and something Violet never knew about. Once, when he and Randall were in high school, David trained it on his friend and yelled, "Bang!" When he stashed the gun, Randall kicked his ass all up and down that tiny apartment. Still, though, he held the loaded gun toward his friends when he was younger, toward a mirror when he was a bit older, and toward a wall a week previous. He really didn't know how to use it. He came to think yelling, "Bang, bang," and looking menacing was a substitute for learning to shoot the thing. Randall had never even held a gun. Randall just had more heart. That's why he volunteered to wield the weapon during the job. Besides, it was all his idea. "It don't matter if I can't work it," Randall said. "Any fool can work a gun, and I won't need to work it. I ain't intending to shoot nobody. Seeing the thing is enough to make that punk-ass clerk shit his pants." The clerk at the liquor store on Franklin Boulevard eyed them both with little fear when Randall aimed the shotgun at him. David was by the door on lookout, trembling. The clerk stood expressionless while Randall ordered him to empty the register. The fragments of light that sparkled from his eyes like two steel drums made David and his friend nervous. Perhaps it was the awkward way Randall clasped the weapon. He held most of his body firm, but his shaky hands told the truth. Or perhaps it was that neither he nor David had a killer's face. Both looked soft and sweet, even when frowning. Either way, the man had been robbed before. Randall and David knew this. His nonchalant eyes seemed to say that he had encountered more competent crooks. The clerk bent quickly behind the counter and pulled out a slim black handgun of his own, a revolver, much less powerful than the shotgun, had the shotgun been in steady hands. He shot once, striking Randall in the chest, then fired 2 more times. One bullet hit the wall. The other struck Randall through his hand as he covered his head. Randall lay on the floor, a fine mist of sticky blood, bone, and brain matter, covering bags of potato chips, sugar cookies, and donuts. David paused, as still as a scarecrow above a cornfield, and then turned to run. The clerk shot once more. For his trouble, David caught a bullet in his backside. A fragment would rest in the meaty flesh of his right butt cheek until he grew old and passed away. The whole affair made page B10 of the Days and Times under the headline, "Son of God, Brother of Prophet, Sentenced in Armed Robbery." David received 5 years for his crime, of which he served 3.5. He spent half a year in prison regretting his decisions. Often he'd think of his mother bawling at his sentencing hearing, hands up high in the air, eyes crimson, face streaked. He smelled the sweet wood of the courtroom benches, heard his mother's guttural yelp, even felt that sinking heavy feeling at the bottom of his stomach. He saw Randall's face often, heard his voice too. It never said anything profound or meaningful, never pointed him toward a path or a way. It sat at his ear, making small talk, occasionally mentioning the Cross River Sound. One morning after the prisoners had eaten their breakfast, David pushed a broom through the mess hall. He spied a stack of plastic buckets turned upside down in the corner. After the lunchtime trays had been stacked and the tables wiped down, he slipped away and returned with some nicked drumsticks he had stolen from his music class and kept hidden in his cell. He was supposed to be cleaning, but instead, David lovingly rearranged the buckets how Randall might have. A smattering of people watched him quizzically. David slammed a drumstick squarely against the flat bottom of a hard bucket. It made a noise that echoed through the mess hall. He was rusty and he knew it, but playing felt so damn good. David played something he knew Randall would love. It didn't matter much that Randall's favorite rhythm now sounded like random thumps against plastic barrels. A corrections officer slapped a table with his baton and ordered David to stop. David tapped on and on as if he hadn't heard, or as if the CO's screams were song and his hard baton slaps accompaniment. A feeling swelled in his chest, something he had never felt before. David decided it was Randall, and he tapped on, closing his eyes and seeing his friend's face. He only stopped when he opened his eyes and saw the tall, skinny, black as licorice CO standing in front of him, ready to strike. David dropped the sticks and threw his hands in the air, and the gesture felt nothing at all like surrender. While David was away, Jeeves grew his hair long and prayed tearfully during his sermons for God to give his youngest brother some direction. God smiled from the clean stained glass windows in Jesus' new church on the south side, as if to say, "Maybe I will help, my son." Jeeves rarely visited his brother in prison, rarely sent money, never wrote. Meanwhile, the second eldest son of God left the church of the twice-risen Christ to form his own church on the north side, the Church of the Ever-Loving Christ. That brother became Christopher Christson, or just Christ the Third, and his church was white like a shining temple on a hill. He favored a short hairstyle and wore sparkling zoot suits made of linen and silk and an assortment of alligator hide shoes. God, he said, never wanted anyone to be poor. This, he argued, despite the fact that his father was homeless for much of his life. God was an entrepreneur, a failed entrepreneur, admittedly. He only failed because he wanted to teach himself humility and suffering. He failed, in other words, Christ the Third said, so we could succeed. As time went on, Christ the Third referred to his father less and less, and then stopped claiming his divinity. Officially in the Church of the Ever-Loving Christ, God was no longer God, but simply a prophet. In practice, though, most still referred to David Sherman's father as divine. David Sherman hit the streets after 3 years and 7 months with a clear plastic bag filled with a few clothes and a handcrafted guitar he made in prison. His mother had joined her husband, God, in the sky. He had 11 brothers and 1 sister, but they didn't seem real. To David, they were all just storybook characters, except for Jeeves, whose face he never wanted to see again. He knew the hate he held for Jeeves was irrational. It burned in his chest like a heart attack. He imagined one day he'd wake and find that it had eaten through his back like the most corrosive acid, and then the hole within him would be made visible for all to see. How does one let go of all that hate? Why would someone let go of the hate if it is all he has? After 2 nights of sleeping on the ground, clutching the guitar like a lover, David found his way to Christ the Third's church. It was a Sunday morning. He settled himself on the front steps, strumming and singing a sad hymn while brown people in suits and fancy hats streamed by. Just before the service was to begin, Christ the Third came out and put his hand on David's shoulder. "Brother," he said, "this is Dad's house, so you better come in. Our oldest brother, or should I say, our coldest brother, would leave you out in the world. But our Father told me he wants you to play for the people. Come in, won't you?" Christ the Third's kindness could never make David love the Father whose madness had created such a broken world. But that day he found a job and some human kindness, and that, for a time, was quite enough. Christ the Third told his brother, "Go out into the world and bring me a band." David hired a bass player named Carter and a sax player named Case. Later, he hired a drummer named Webbs, but fired him for playing too slow. He fired the next one for sloppiness. The next one came to practice late and laughed too much. He didn't stand a chance, really. David could fire a drummer in a minute. He settled on a musician named Nat who played sort of like Randall. At least he held the drumsticks the same way. At a certain angle, he even looked like Randall. Cracked jokes like him. Walked like him. David would get lost during practice time observing Nat lovingly, mournfully. Then he'd snap at Nat for playing too slow or too fast or like a damned blues player. Nat always ignored David's rants, but one afternoon he dropped his drumsticks and stormed out. He returned the next day as if nothing had happened. David shrugged. Bigger things seized his mind, like how to refashion jazz into gospel and gospel into jazz, searching for the sound of Cross River. David wandered the town, sitting in juke joints, talking to people in barber shops, and parking himself for hours at River's Edge where his father once sat listening for the rhythm. David would go home humming a melody, but when he tried to turn it into a composition, it sounded flat and bland. So on Sunday mornings, the band would play jazzed-up versions of Negro spirituals and gospel standards. It was passable, good enough, great at times even, but it was just background noise. His heart swelled with love for God, and often when he prayed for a new sound, though he remembered what Delante had told him once. God answers all prayers, and sometimes his answer is no. One morning, as David tuned his guitar, Christ III mentioned that there was a pretty woman with no husband who worked with the Sunday school children. After all, Christ III said, who ever heard of a church elder with no woman at his side? I'm not an elder, David said. And you'll never be one if you don't have a woman, Christ III replied, flashing a wicked smile. Gwendolyn stood tall and wore long dresses that often swept the ground and made her appear taller. She walked with a glide. Christ III introduced them after the service one day and chaperoned their early dates himself. Man and woman, Christ III preached, should never be alone together until God or his representative blesses their union. She was sultry and sexy in her movements and even her voice. The bones of her cheeks sat high and firm, and her skin looked soft, her neck long. David daydreamed of holding her hand, but that would lead to sin. Even the daydreaming was a sin. David didn't mind sin, but he knew he had to pretend to hate sin if he ever wanted to engage in some. They spent long hours talking after Sunday service or walking through a nearby park, always tailed by a church member or in the company of another couple. Soon, it seemed, she had always been there and always would be there. David proposed in April and married Gwendolyn in May, wondering the whole time if he had done it just so they could be alone, just to run fingers along her cheekbones, just to leave soft, shallow pools of saliva along her torso. He told her of his quest to recreate the beat of all cross-Riverian things one morning after they had been married some months. They lay there half-dressed, with slats of early sunlight peeking in on them. She seemed distracted. This town has its own sound, he said. Things are different soon as you leave. You can't feel it no more. I'm trying to get the guys to capture that. But dude we got on the drums, I might need to fire that guy. He just ain't it. I knew a dude with half the education, but twice the soul. Baby, she replied. Nat is all right. Stop being antsy. I like the way he plays. David carried on, but Gwendolyn looked toward the wall where a brown spider ran about. None of that is important, David, his wife said, running her hand across her stomach. You think this little baby in here care about Nat? Nah, he gonna need food and shelter, and someone to teach him to listen for God's love. Little baby? And like that, they were no longer alone. David wanted to name the child Rhythm, and after some weeks, he got Gwendolyn to agree, but the church rejected that. So they named the boy Randy. Randy was small and pink for a long time after he was born, almost like a white baby. Right down.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?